intellectual guru was Milton Friedman's old mentor, Friedrich von Hayek. And just over a year later, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. Both Britain and America were now ruled by unabashed Freemanites.
Margaret Thatcher's program when she came in had 4 planks. Cut government spending, cut tax rates, reduce government ownership and operation of industries or regulation of industry, and have a moderate and stable monetary policy to bring down inflation.
Within her first 3 years in office, unemployment doubled in parts of the economy, leading to waves of strikes. Thatcher's personal approval rating slumped to 25%. There were riots in Britain's major cities. Even Margaret Thatcher's admirers had their doubts.
The economic performance of the Thatcher government has been mixed.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favorite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
Friedrich von Hayek urged Thatcher to copy Pinochet's economic shock therapy policies. Thatcher replied, "In Britain, with our democratic institutions and with the need for a high degree of consent, some of the measures adopted in Chile are quite unacceptable."
Thatcher's profound unpopularity seemed to be proving once again that free market fundamentalism was simply too unpopular, too directly harmful to too many people to survive in a democratic state where governing requires getting the consent of the governed, unlike a military dictatorship. What pulled Thatcher back from the abyss and ultimately saved the project was a crisis. Indeed, it was the ultimate crisis. It was a war.
We are here because for the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete. HMS Invincible will be in the lead.
Most people in Britain had never even heard of the Falklands. But when Argentina invaded the small group of islands thousands of miles away in the South Atlantic, Thatcher seized her opportunity to prove her credentials as the Iron Lady.
Gentlemen, I've just heard that the white flag is flying over Stanley.
The war was over in less than 3 months. As the troops returned to Britain, a wave of patriotic celebrations swept the country. Thatcher won the 1983 elections with a massive majority. She could now push through a form of the economic shock therapy witnessed in Chile. The most powerful union in Britain was the National Union of Mine Workers. When the National Coal Board tried to close pits down, the miners went on strike.
Parts of central London are brought to a halt as thousands of miners and sympathizers march through the city in support of the miners' strike. It's Britain's longest and most bitter since 1926, and the most expensive ever.
The strike lasted almost a year. Thatcher used every means at her disposal to destroy the union. Eventually, the miners were defeated. Thatcher used this victory to bring the Chicago School Revolution to Britain. A series of glossy commercials promoted a massive program of privatizations. Thatcher sold off the steel industry, water, electricity, gas, telephones, airlines, oil. public housing was sold off. Council services put out a tender. In 1986, financial and banking services were deregulated. It was called the Big Bang.
No one here tonight needs reminding that the Big Bang is only a beginning.
In Britain, before Thatcher, a CEO earned 10 times as much as the average worker. By 2007, they earned more than 100 times as much. In the US before Reagan, CEOs earned 43 times as much as the average worker. By 2005, they earned more than 400 times as much. Friedman openly acknowledged the importance of Thatcher and Reagan in the spreading of Chicago school policies around the world.
The coincidence of Thatcher and Reagan having been in office at the same time was enormously important for the public acceptance worldwide of a different approach to economic and monetary policy.
Thank you very much.
What I'm describing now is a plan and a hope for the long term. The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people.
Now, we all know the fairy tale about the fall of communism, that the West under Reagan and Thatcher looked so prosperous to the people of the former communist bloc that they themselves demanded radical free market policies. Now, this really is a fairy tale. It is true that people who had been living under authoritarian communism genuinely wanted democracy. And it's also true that people wanted to be able to go out and buy blue jeans and have Big Macs. That is true. But that does not mean that they wanted the kind of Wild West capitalism of oligarchs gone mad and no social protections that so many Eastern Bloc countries actually ended up with and suffer under to this day.
Thatcher had done everything she could to break the power of the unions in Britain. But in 1988, she went to Poland to show her support for the workers' union Solidarity.
How do you see the process from where you are now to where you want to be?
Strikes in Poland led to Solidarity being allowed to contest a general election in June 1989. This triggered a wave of demonstrations throughout Eastern Europe. In the past, the Soviet Union had used military force to crush democratic movements. But the Soviet Union had a new type of leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was committed to glasnost and perestroika. He talked about a third way, a gradual transition to Scandinavian-style social democracy, something between free market capitalism and communism. Gorbachev charmed the public and politicians of the West.
He's a bold, a determined and courageous leader.
Gorbachev stood and watched as one by one the old communist regimes collapsed. At the end of the year, the most famous symbol of the division of Europe came tumbling down. For Friedman and the Chicago boys, a whole new world opened up. In the Soviet Union, Gorbachev was hoping to gradually reform the Russian economy. In 1991, Gorbachev was invited to the G7 summit in London. He was hoping for financial support for his gradual economic reforms. Instead, he was told that unless he embraced radical shock therapy, there would be no aid at all.
That's not a little close.
The next month, there was a coup attempt against him. A group of Communist Party hardliners placed Gorbachev under house arrest in his holiday home in the Crimea. Tanks surrounded the White House, the Russian parliament.
Amid the chaos of street clashes, it was obvious that to reinforce their position, the hardliners would have to resort to violence. Such action between the people and the security forces has not been seen since the early days of the Russian Revolution. By dawn this morning, amid a sea of debris, it was becoming clear that the coup was disintegrating. The Russian parliament building was unscathed, the military had not made their move. Inside, Boris Yeltsin was more powerful than ever.
This was Yeltsin's finest hour. Gorbachev was released and he returned to Moscow, but he had lost much of his power.
Я выражаю признательность за принципиальную позицию россиянам, президенту России Борису Николаевичу Ельцину.
In December 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved, a profound shock for the Russian people. Yeltsin was now in charge of economic policy for the Russian Federation. The free market came to Russia. There was chaos. The adoption of Chicago school policies in Russia marked the beginning of a new chapter in the free market crusade. It was all shock, no therapy. Despite the public efforts to promote popular capitalism, the reality was a small handful of businessmen made vast fortunes. State industries were sold off at bargain basement prices. The Russian press dubbed Yeltsin's advisors the Chicago Boys. Yeltsin's shock therapy meant that in 1992, the average Russian consumed 40% less than in 1991. A third of Russians fell below the poverty line, and wages weren't paid for months.
One expert today predicted 140 million Russians will soon be living below the poverty line.
Corruption was rife. Organised crime boomed. Moscow became the new Wild West. The majority of Russians opposed the Chicago Boys' radical vision for their country. In March 1993, Parliament made a crucial decision. It voted to repeal the special powers it had given to Yeltsin. Yeltsin declared a state of emergency. The Constitutional Court ruled that it was illegal. On September 21st, Yeltsin took the Pinochet option and dissolved Parliament.
Сегодняшнего дня прерывается осуществление законодательной, распорядительной и контрольной функций съезда народных депутатов.
The West threw its weight behind Yeltsin.
We feel that Boris Yeltsin is the best hope for democracy in Russia.
2 days later, Parliament voted to impeach Yeltsin by 636 votes to 2. Thousands of supporters of the Parliament gathered outside the White House and marched on the television station. It looked like the supporters of Parliament were winning. Yeltsin flew back to Moscow from his holiday home. That night, 100 demonstrators were killed as the Yeltsin authorities